performing acts in the business, and I guess as the title of their song states,
For almost 20 years, a Philadelphia family has been waiting for answers, for justice. But they won't give up. They're hoping one day police will be able to find out who murdered their loved one, John Whitehead.
How many songs have you written in your lives?
About 50.
For whom have you written songs? Listen to this list of people.
The OJs, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. Whoever's trying to record, we'll record that record on that particular person. If it's us, we'll get it. If it's Teddy Pendergrass, he'll get it. The OJs, whoever else. We don't.
It's really the way it works.
That's the way it works.
The singers behind Ain't No Stopping Us Now secretly hated each other, and the stories coming out now are even worse than anyone thought. McFadden and Whitehead were seen as a symbol of unity, soul, and survival. But offstage, it was war. The same duo that inspired millions with their unstoppable energy were allegedly giving each other the silent treatment in the studio and accusing one another of sabotage.
you were together then.
Right. We were together
As
since
what?
we were 3 years old.
I see.
And we just groomed ourselves into
Were you in groups or?
Yeah, we first started off, we had a group called the Epsilons, then we changed it to the Talk of the Town, and now it's McFadden Whitehead.
When it,
They started as childhood friends, grew up in the rough neighborhoods of Philly, survived street violence, poverty, and even a near-death flight crash. But it wasn't the outside world that tore them apart. It was each other. So, what exactly went wrong? Before the music, before the fame, McFadden and Whitehead were just two kids from Philly trying to survive. Gene McFadden had moved to Philadelphia from South Carolina as a child. John Whitehead was born and raised there. They met as teenagers at Edison High School, deep in North Philadelphia, a neighborhood defined by grit, poverty, and limited options. But what they had was rare, a bond built on music, loyalty, and the dream of making it out. Together with a few friends, they formed a group called the Epsilons. The group was tight. They rehearsed daily, harmonized in the streets, and stayed out of trouble by staying inside the music. That brotherhood got them noticed. Otis Redding himself invited them to tour with him in 1967 after hearing them sing backstage. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. For a year, Gene and John lived out every young singer's dream, traveling across America as part of the Otis Redding Review.
Didn't you run around all of the world with Otis Redding at one point?
Yes, we did. And then when he died, that's when we came back to Philadelphia and put ourselves in the hands of Gamble and Huff.
But then, everything changed. Otis Redding died in a plane crash that same year. The group fell apart. The dream dimmed. But McFadden and Whitehead kept going. They rebranded, regrouped, and eventually began working under Gamble and Huff at Philadelphia International Records. First as mailroom workers, then songwriters. That's where they created Backstabbers for the OJs. That song became the label's first gold single and the start of what became known as the Philly Sound.
like the Backstabbers album, how many songs did you?
We wrote 3 on that album. That was the first time we ever attempted to write a song. Backstabber was our first song we ever wrote.
The success felt like destiny. For years, they were inseparable, writing over 400 songs, producing hits for Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, Lou Rawls, and Teddy Pendergrass. Then, in 1979, they released Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now, a defiant anthem they initially wrote for the OJs but decided to keep for themselves.
Performing acts in the business, and I guess as the title of their song states,
It became their identity, their declaration. But somewhere between gold records and Grammy nominations, the cracks started to show. Friends began noticing they weren't speaking as much. In the studio, they'd sit on opposite ends. They'd write separately. And rumors swirled that Whitehead thought McFadden was trying to control their sound. That McFadden believed Whitehead was dragging his feet and refusing to evolve. Things got worse when money got involved. Sources close to the duo say royalty checks became a source of tension. Management meetings grew tense. One of their former accountants allegedly warned that the group could dissolve if they didn't resolve their financial disagreements. They stopped brainstorming together. Their collaborations started to feel like obligations, not passion. And when they began working with other artists separately, attending events apart, booking solo studio sessions, fans didn't realize that it wasn't just creative growth, it was distance, real distance. And though they never publicly acknowledged a feud, those closest to them knew the relationship had turned cold. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same men who wrote Backstabbers were now acting like the lyrics were about each other. It wasn't just creative differences or money. It was years of ego, pride, and personal disappointment that slowly replaced trust with resentment. And by the early 1980s, their friendship, the one that had taken them from Philly sidewalks to world stages, was barely hanging on, and no one knew just how bad it would get. From the outside, McFadden and Whitehead still looked like a unit. They appeared together at award shows. They posed for photos. They even did interviews where they smiled and praised each other. But behind the scenes, their sessions had grown painfully quiet. People who worked closely with them during that time noticed the change immediately. What used to be an electric creative space, filled with back-and-forth jokes, spontaneous harmonies, and long nights of writing, had turned cold. Studio engineers recall sessions where the two barely spoke. They'd come in, lay down their parts, and leave without a handshake. At first, people brushed it off. Maybe it was just tension from the workload. Maybe they were tired. But then it started affecting the music. Producers said the chemistry was off. The passion in the performances was still there, but the soul, the shared vision, was fading. Some blamed the tension on creative control. Gene McFadden had always been more polished, more structured in his process. He treated the music like business. John Whitehead, on the other hand, was more spiritual, spontaneous. He believed in letting the music come naturally, without force.
Whoever's time to record, we'll record that record on that particular person. If it's us, we'll get it. If it's Teddy Pendergrass, he'll get it. The OJs or whoever else. We don't.
It's really the way it works.
That's the way it works.
Those differences, once complementary, became weapons. They clashed on lyrics, on arrangements, on how they should respond to newer trends like funk, disco, and hip-hop. Every song became a negotiation. Every decision a power struggle. Then came the rumors about money. People in their circle started talking about disputes over songwriting credits and royalties. Some say McFadden wanted to renegotiate their royalty split. Others say Whitehead felt he was being pushed out of key decisions. The tension wasn't always explosive. In fact, that was the scariest part. It was quiet, lingering. They didn't fight loud. They avoided each other, didn't make eye contact, didn't ride together to shows. They would often have their managers coordinate logistics just to keep from having direct conversations. It got so bad that friends close to them began to worry about whether they'd finish their next album. And when they finally did, Moving On, released in 1982, the music was solid. But it lacked that old spark. The record didn't match the success of Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now and failed to generate major hits beyond I Heard It in a Love Song. Critics chalked it up to changing times, but those who knew the backstory said otherwise. In private, both men began pursuing other collaborations, working with other songwriters, recording tracks that didn't include the other's input.
Wake up, everybody, no more sleeping.
The silence between them had grown so normal that by the mid-80s, even their fans had started to pick up on it. The magic was still there, but the brotherhood that had once defined them was gone. What no one expected was how quickly the professional split would be followed by something far worse. Because while the friendship was collapsing in slow motion, life had its own timeline, and soon tragedy would strike. In 1979, McFadden and Whitehead should have been on top of the world. Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now was dominating the airwaves. They were Grammy-nominated, chart-topping, and finally getting the recognition they had worked for all their lives. But what many don't know is how close they came to losing everything in a single night. On May 25th, 1979, they were in Chicago promoting the single. The plan was to board American Airlines Flight 191 to Los Angeles later that evening, a routine trip to continue their whirlwind press tour. But something changed. A last-minute request came in for one more interview. Just one. They agreed. That decision saved their lives. Flight 191 crashed just minutes after takeoff from O'Hare Airport. All 258 people on board were killed. It remains one of the deadliest aviation disasters in U.S. history.
Moments later, as seen from the Channel 9 helicopter, the plane smashed into a field just north of the airport runway.
The media barely touched on their narrow escape. To the public, it was just a lucky break. But for Gene and John, it was more than that. It was a wake-up call, a moment that should have brought them closer again. For a few weeks it did. Those close to the duo recall how humbled and shaken they were afterward. There was an unspoken sense that maybe, just maybe, they were being given a second chance, not just at life, but at brotherhood. But whatever clarity they gained in those days didn't last. As the 1980s unfolded, the music industry began shifting. Disco was on its way out. Hip-hop and New Jack Swing were gaining ground. McFadden and Whitehead, once at the center of Philadelphia's soul movement, now found themselves fighting for relevance. Their new projects didn't chart. Labels began losing interest. Instead of pulling together, they pulled further apart. Professionally, they tried to maintain appearances. They released Movin' On in 1982. They performed at smaller venues. But privately, the distance between them was becoming harder to ignore. Collaborations became strained. The music lost its urgency. They both started battling demons, privately and publicly. Drugs crept into the picture. So did financial struggles. The royalties from Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now were impressive, but not enough to weather bad contracts, legal disputes, and mismanagement. As their bank accounts shrank, so did their tolerance for each other. The crash they avoided in 1979 was literal, but the slow-motion collapse of their careers in the following decade, that was spiritual. Still, there were moments, fleeting ones, when reconciliation seemed possible. In the early 90s, they began appearing together again at corporate events and nostalgic soul festivals. They'd sing Backstabbers and Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now as if nothing had ever gone wrong. But those performances weren't about friendship anymore. They were about survival. Behind the curtain, it was clear the wounds had never healed. They were two men doing a job, not two friends sharing a dream. The flight they missed in 1979 should have been a moment of permanent transformation. But instead, it became another what if in a long list of missed opportunities. What if they had used that moment to rebuild trust? What if they had restructured their business and cleaned up their inner circles? What if they had simply said what needed to be said? Instead, they let time pass. And time had already made other plans. By the time the 1990s arrived, the divide between Gene McFadden and John Whitehead was no longer just professional. It was personal. Their creative partnership had crumbled. Their friendship had flatlined. And now their personal lives were unraveling just as fast as their careers. Years of stress, fame, and disappointment had taken their toll. Behind the polished performances and radio-friendly melodies, both men were struggling with addiction. Drugs had become an escape, a way to cope with the loss of control, the betrayal they felt from each other, and the brutal reality that the industry no longer cared. McFadden and Whitehead weren't alone. The late 80s and early 90s were a devastating time for many artists who came up in the 70s. Record deals dried up. Royalty checks got smaller. And for black musicians in particular, the support system they once relied on had vanished. As the music stopped, so did the money. Both men began facing serious financial problems. Years of legal disputes over royalty payments and publishing rights left them drained. and when the checks stopped coming in, the tension between them only grew. John Whitehead's troubles went even further. In a twist that shocked even those closest to him, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to a short prison term. For a man who once stood on stage receiving gold records, the mugshot was a public humiliation. Friends say prison changed him, made him quieter, more guarded, and more cynical about the industry. When he got out, he tried to bounce back. In 1988, he released a solo album titled I Need Money Bad. The title alone said it all. The album wasn't a success commercially, but it was a raw reflection of everything he was going through: poverty, regret, and bitterness. Meanwhile, McFadden was dealing with his own demons. Addiction had taken its toll on his health and his relationships. By the mid-90s, they were both shadows of who they used to be. They began doing small gigs again: corporate events, soul revivals, nostalgia shows. But even those felt transactional. There were no joint interviews, no documentaries, no books, no acknowledgement of the pain between them. They showed up, did the job, and left in separate cars. For years, fans hoped for a true comeback: a new album, a reunion tour, a sit-down interview where they'd talk through the feud. But that never came. The silence remained, and then everything changed. Again. On May 11, 2004, news broke that John Whitehead had been shot and killed outside his home in West Philadelphia.
Whitehead was working on a car behind his West Oak Lane home when eyewitnesses say 3 shooters ambushed him.
His car was parked right here?
No one was ever charged. It's hard to carry that for years.
He was struck multiple times and died at the scene. He was only 55 years old. The city mourned. The music world paused. But justice? That never came. Investigators said they believed John wasn't the intended target, that he may have been caught in a crossfire meant for someone else. But to this day, no one has been arrested, no one has been charged, and no one has ever been held accountable. For nearly 20 years, John Whitehead's family has waited. His daughter Lakia still speaks out, begging for answers, reminding the world that her father wasn't just a voice on a record. He was a human being with a family left behind in pain. The murder left the city shaken. McFadden, already battling cancer, was devastated. They hadn't spoken much in years, but the news hit hard. 2 years later, on January 27, 2006, just one day before his 57th birthday, Gene McFadden passed away from complications related to liver and lung cancer. There was no reunion, no final performance, no moment of healing. They were both gone. And while Ain't No Stoppin' Us now played on in movies, TV shows, and political rallies, the men behind the song were no longer here to see it. Their deaths came just as the world was beginning to rediscover their contributions. The Philadelphia soul movement they helped shape was being revisited by a new generation. Artists like Mary J. Blige, Will Smith, Luther Vandross, and Jay-Z had sampled or honored their work. Their songs were being remixed, their lyrics printed on t-shirts, their sound echoed in stadiums and protest marches alike. But the story behind the sound, the betrayal, the silence, the unresolved pain, was still buried. It wasn't until 2016 that their families won a small but meaningful victory. A federal court ruled that the heirs of McFadden and Whitehead would retain the rights to their song catalog. That meant royalties would continue to go to the people they loved, not corporations or managers who had once mismanaged them. In 2017, the duo was posthumously inducted into the Philadelphia Music Walk of Fame. It was a long overdue recognition. Photos from the event show fans holding up vinyl covers and wiping away tears. But both men were already gone. And even in death, the questions remain. What if they had made peace? What if they had one more album in them? One more tour? One honest conversation? What if the pain hadn't gotten so loud that it drowned out the music? Today, when Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now plays, it's still a symbol of resilience, of victory. But for those who know the full story, it also holds a quiet sadness. Because the real tragedy isn't just that they died, it's that they never healed. To the world, McFadden and Whitehead will always be the duo who gave us Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now, a song about power, resilience, and pushing through. But for those who were close, the story behind the music was far from inspirational. It was painful, messy, and in many ways, tragic. They started as brothers, teenagers with big dreams, scribbling lyrics in Philly basements, catching the attention of legends like Otis Redding, then writing chart toppers for Teddy Pendergrass, the OJs, and Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. Together, they were unstoppable, until they weren't. Their feud didn't explode overnight. It was slow, quiet, a buildup of resentment over credit, control, and cash. And by the time they were supposed to be celebrating their legacy, they were barely on speaking terms. The music industry moved on, labels stopped calling, and while Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now remained a radio staple, the men behind it were aging out of relevance, still stuck in a silent rivalry that never got resolved. Some say the feud itself damaged their legacy, that without the bitterness, they could have become one of the greatest duos in soul music history. They had the talent, the vision, the work ethic, but they didn't have each other anymore. Even after their deaths, their story feels incomplete. One was murdered without justice. The other died quietly, surrounded by family, but haunted by a career that ended in silence. They never made peace, never reconciled publicly, never told their side. And maybe that's why it hurts even more, because we still sing their song, still chant the lyrics at weddings, protests, graduations, still call it an anthem. But behind that anthem was a friendship that fell apart, and two men who never got to say goodbye. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.